Hi, it's Christine Daigle.
It's Kevin Tumlinson.
And I'm JD Barker. Welcome to Writers Inc. I need to apologize in advance. So I think I've mentioned I've got construction going on at the house. So we built a detached garage a few years ago, and we're building like this. It was supposed to be just like a breezeway to go from the garage to the main house, but we kind of blew it out and turned it into this giant room. But today they're actually cutting the hole in the wall between the addition and the house to actually tie it in so we can get into this new addition from the outside, which is crazy loud and it's rattling like the entire structure. So
So are
if,
we
if
just
you
gonna
hear
see
something like
somebody like
that,
plunge through that bookcase behind you like the Kool-Aid man? Is that
yeah,
what we're gonna?
that's kind of what's happening, but they're on the other side of the house. And like I literally just locked like the contractors came in. I put them in like it's a closet, like a walk-in closet, and it's being turned into a hallway. So I locked them in this closet. They're like, close the door behind us. We're gonna tape it so no dust gets through. So it's like these two giant guys locked in a closet with a bunch of like power tools cutting their way out. Like they're basically cutting a hole through the wall to get into this
Sounds
this
like high
addition that they
school to
built.
me. That was my prom.
Yeah, like I feel like I should have put a camera in there because there's comedy happening, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was like a scene from Saw. You're just gonna put this camera in there. These guys with power tools trying to cut their way out of this small, tiny
I,
room.
I just get nervous. Like anytime you cut into a wall in a house, you never really know what you're gonna find. Like there could be
Right.
water
Yeah,
pipes in there or electrical, and like there's
yeah,
always something because like it's Murphy's Law, right? Like it's
yeah.
something is going to be in your way.
Yeah.
And I don't know what they're gonna find yet, but
Do they like
that
drill
that's
and look with
happened.
the camera before they go through it, or they're
I
just
was
kind
gonna
of not
say they
up
probably
down?
scope it.
Yeah, they
They
probably
told me
scope it.
they opened the wall from the outside. The way I understood is they cut like a very shallow cut, like enough to get the layer of plywood off. So I guess a half inch or three quarters or whatever, and then they
Yeah,
can pop that off, get to the studs, and they pull the insulation out from the backside. That's the way I think they're doing it. If it were me, I would probably just plunge right in with the saw and trip the breakers as I cut the electrical wires and hope water doesn't start spraying out at me. But I'm not a professional. This is why I don't do this.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They won't even let me wear a hard hat.
Jeez.
Okay.
All
Any
right.
people got announcements? JD, you have a thing going on. Do you want to talk about it? We didn't discuss it
We
before.
probably should talk about it.
I
Yeah.
think you
So.
should.
I always come up with some weird outside of the box way to promote every book, and the last one kind of got me in trouble, so I dialed it back for this one. Um, but so the book is it's about a haunted house. It's about a kid who inherits a house from his grandmother. It's the only house on a tiny little private island off the coast of New Hampshire, basically right where I live. It's a real house. He inherits it, and him and his friends basically take it over as a party house. But ultimately, they get bored and they decide, well, what would it take to turn a perfectly normal house into a haunted house? They start with Ouija boards and the things that would, kind of expect them to go, do. But the tagline for the book is for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. Right on the cover, so you know where they're going, but they don't actually start there. But as part of the promo for this book, because it's based on a real house, that's sitting out there. I worked with the people that actually own the property, and we organized an overnight stay. So we created a contest where one person we're going to draw their name. They're going to get to take three of their friends, and we're going to take them by boat to this house because it's on a private island. So we got to take them out there by boat, drop them off on the dock, and leave them alone for 24 hours, and come back for them a day later. So they're going to spend the night in a haunted house. So we started the contest yesterday. There was a national press release that went out on it. I did a couple interviews about it this morning. It's a cool idea. I would love to do it. A lot of people are scared, S-less to do
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
but
yeah. It was a
I think
hard pass from Kevin.
Including myself.
yeah.
I'm too scared.
Yeah, because I'm like, yeah, this is exactly the sort of framework you see in an actual horror story. Like, oh, look at this movie about this author who wrote a book and he's promoting it on this island, and then all of a sudden everything in the book is coming to life and grabbing me. No, I'm out. No,
Yeah,
this
there are
is
people that live for that stuff though, that love haunted houses and staying in haunted houses. So I know you're going to get a
Well, there,
flood. It just won't be me.
the island's got some crazy history because like it was used during the Spanish-American War as a prison. They put people out there as a quarantine zone during yellow fever. So like people have died all around this place. Back in the 70s, they found somebody took their boat out there. A lot of boaters will just go out there, they'll picnic and stuff like that. Some guy was out there picnicking with his girlfriend, and they found two bodies buried on the beach. And there's only one newspaper story about it from 1972, and we found that, and it names the guy who investigated. He later became a DA. They came out. They had trouble trying to figure out who should actually investigate this because the island itself itself is right on the border of New Hampshire and Maine. So everybody basically points fingers. Nobody wants it. It's like a hot potato. The FBI apparently took over this investigation. All this happened in like 1972, but in today's world, nobody's got a record of it, other than that one newspaper article where they found the bodies. Like the FBI's got no record of this ever happening. They've got no record of an investigation. None of the local police agencies have anything in their files. So it's really weird. It just kind of disappeared. But like the island just has tons of crazy weird stuff that has happened out there. So yeah, so I'm just hoping we're going to send 4 people out there. They're going to have a good time. If somebody actually dies during this little excursion, I'm in a lot of trouble.
You got to get some signatures, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's gonna be some big time NDAs for this, or
or release of
protection,
Releasing,
whatever
yeah.
releases. Yeah,
No liability.
yeah. So we'll keep you posted on it, but that's fun. All right,
Awesome.
what is
That's
going on in the
fun.
news?
Well, I wanted to say I'm doing Confusion this
Oh.
weekend in Detroit, so I'm doing a conference. But by the time this comes out, it will already be done. So if you're at Confusion, hello
All
from
right.
Detroit, come see me. Come say hi.
Murder and confusion. That does sound like you
Yeah,
guys.
I think isn't Confusion is the best name for a con.
Confusion.
Confusion. Yeah, it's
That's
like
funny.
it's the 50th anniversary this year, so should be a good one.
All right.
Cool.
All right. Well, in the
News.
news, TikTok uncertainty prompts the book business to envision an even better future. The book industry is actively preparing for potential changes in TikTok's accessibility due to the ongoing legal and political challenges surrounding the platform. As TikTok remains an influential marketing tool, publishers and booksellers are considering more controlled and direct ways to connect with readers. The need for platforms where the industry can control interactions with algorithmic interference was emphasized, suggesting a shift toward more personal and direct engagement channels like email lists and in-person events. It is almost like they are taking a page straight out of Kevin's book of what you should do and what you shouldn't do in promoting
Yeah.
yourself.
Well, this was interesting just because I've seen a lot of articles and all the podcasts I've been listening to with the TikTok almost going away have started looking at this
Yeah.
about, well, we're beholden to an algorithm and to someone else's platforms. So people are looking at returning to 15 years ago. I've heard lots of talks about going back to book bloggers, right? Tastemakers on their own platforms and a push to try to get the industry. This is what there's push for industry for the big five to promote their authors and put some money into it on platforms that don't belong to other people. Imagine that. I think it's great. I was like, yeah, we need to do that.
That's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah.
I've been doing this all along. Like I love book bloggers, and a lot of them just evolved. Like they started off with a blog, and now they're have got Instagram accounts and they're on TikTok, so they've just kind of evolved into these influencer roles. But like that group, you send them a book. It costs you $10 to get an ARC and put it in their hand. They write it up on all these different platforms. A lot of them shoot video. They promote the hell out of it. And it lights up sales. It's so much better than getting a write up in a traditional newspaper where it lands in somebody's inbox. They click on the link and they hit a paywall. Like they've got to subscribe to read the interview or the review. Like it's to me like that's just a dead end. So I throw money at book bloggers all the time. It's always paid off.
How are you finding them? Like is there like a centralized place where you're finding book bloggers?
Well, initially, and this goes back, God, close to 10 years now, there were websites that listed book reviewers or book bloggers with contact information. So initially, I just had people go through and we combed those. We just grabbed every email address we could find and we dropped them into a MailChimp account, on a list. And just every book that I've come out, we hit that list and offer them a copy of the book. Over time, I've just added more and more people to that list. A lot of them for me now come from NetGalley. I take every book that's coming out, I put it on NetGalley for 3 months. And at the end of that, NetGalley gives you a list of everybody that requested that particular title. And a lot of those people are influencers. So I take that list, you get it by Excel and I import that into MailChimp too. So then they get a copy, the next time I have a book coming out, they get the invite to get a free copy. So with every book, I probably add maybe 200 to 800 or so new subscribers to that list. And it just keeps growing and growing.
So NetGalley charges though, right, to host a book? That's something you have to pay for?
They do. I'm a member of IBPA, and through them they've got a discount program.
Yeah,
It's not. I mean, it's still expensive. If I had to guess, I think I paid $300 to $400 to have the book on there for 3 months. But it's worth it because not only do you get to cultivate this list, and grow that, but when the book is released, all these people that reviewed it on NetGalley, they tend to go out to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and those places and repost their reviews. So you come out of the gate with a couple hundred reviews, which is always nice.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said what I wanted to emphasize was that if you join somewhere like that or there are other co-ops, it's cheaper. So if you're thinking about
Yeah.
getting your book on NetGalley, look at some co-ops for sure.
Yeah.
Look at co-ops.
Co-ops.
I'm making notes here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one. You hear that typing? Okay.
That typing is
Uh,
Kevin making notes.
that's me. Okay. Next up, Apple suspends error-strewn AI generated news alerts. This is actually one of my favorite stories of the week. I'm going to be honest with you. But Apple has paused its AI generated news summary feature after receiving backlash for mistakes in headline summaries. The feature will remain disabled in news and entertainment apps with AI generated summaries in other apps marked to indicate their AI origin. Apple plans to refine the feature before they relaunch. I it's in why this is interesting to me is I'm watching this unfold across the industry, and it's the same story over and over again. Like everyone's rushing to be,
Yeah.
they want to be the big name in this. Like they want to be the Google of AI summaries or whatever, and just own that. And because of that, they are just throwing caution to the wind and just running with whatever. And you end up with like racist AIs, and you end up with like these crazy outcomes that could have been prevented with a little more time.
Yeah. Apple AI can't catch a break. I don't they've been
Yeah.
trying and failing hard. And then I've been watching all the other AI things that have been coming out. I forget OpenAI had some Stargate announcement. I don't know what that is. And then Claude is putting a ton of cash into like super intelligent AI, which would be the next step. So we'll have to see. But the race is interesting. I'm kind of keeping eyes on it. And
Yeah.
Poor Apple is trying so hard and failing at the moment. So
They even tried to brand it. They tried to brand it with Apple Intelligence. Like, oh, AI.
uh,
Dirt, 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 dirt. Yeah, I get it.
How much do you want to bet that's trademarked?
Oh,
it probably
I
is. Yeah.
guarantee that's trademarked.
Hmm.
And
It,
that's what they
it's
want to
it's
do. Yeah.
it's crazy. Like it's literally just popping up everywhere though. Like if you go on Amazon now, there's an AI summary of all the reviews. So like you don't even have to read all the reviews anymore. And it's no more clear than if you were to read all the reviews. Like it gives you
Right.
both, this is the greatest product ever. People love it because of this, and this, and people hate it because of this, and this, and it's terrible. So like
Yeah.
it completely summarizes nonsense, which doesn't really help you at all. And I noticed on my text messenger on my iPhone, all of a sudden it started giving me like complete sentences that I can click on.
Yeah.
So before I would start typing in a text and it would kind of give me the word, like a preemptive, this is probably the next word I'm going to type to save me a little time. Now it's full on sentences and responses.
Yeah.
So we're almost to the point where you can have an iMessage conversation between the two AIs, just like on both sides. Like you don't even need a person anymore to do that. Um, yeah,
Which
they need to
works
dial
out.
it back.
If
Yeah,
I'm going to
I'm sure it
eliminate
does.
myself from anything, I'd love to eliminate myself from most of the text messaging. That would be fine by me.
I'm going to call you
Well,
about that, Kevin, and we're going to schedule a meeting.
There will be no phone call. All right. Uh, Next up, Instagram Reels can be 3 minutes long now. Instagram now allows 3 minute Reels, doubling the previous 90-second limit following user feedback. This change aligns with TikTok's earlier, this is the key phrase here. This change
Hmm.
aligns
mhm.
with, quote, TikTok's earlier move to longer videos. Instagram has tested extending limits further, but has yet to roll out longer videos for Reels.
There is so much weirdness going on because of TikTok. So Trump stepped in,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you saw the video. Like he sat at his desk when he was signing all these executive orders, and they had cameras
Yeah.
rolling. And when he got to the one for TikTok, like he literally had no real plan. Like he just he extended it for 75 days. The way
Yeah.
the law is actually written, he can extend, I believe it's up to 270 days total. But those extensions hinge on the fact that like there's supposed to be a deal in the works. Like it's basically to buy time for a deal that's already playing out. And it doesn't sound like there's actually a deal in the works. And he's saying that he would like to collect 50% of TikTok's revenue for the US,
Mhm.
which is something I'm pretty sure China is going to, raise a hand on and say, hey, I don't know if we're okay with that. And ultimately, like if China doesn't want to sell, which is what they're saying, like none of this is going to happen. So I think we're
Yeah.
seeing an extension go on, but I don't know if anything is really changing. And the other thing that's floating around on TikTok, if you actually go on the platform, a lot of people seem to think that Facebook or Meta has already bought it. And I think all this appears, I think it's a rumor, but there's a lot of links on TikTok that weren't necessarily there before. And there's a Facebook account that's there now that's kind of growing very rapidly. And it seems to somehow be involved in the algorithm. Like as soon as the Facebook account was noticed, everybody noticed their feed was off. It was throwing a lot of stuff at them that they wouldn't normally see. And if you went in there and you blocked the Facebook account, all of a sudden everything in the algorithm went back to normal, which is
Wow.
very odd. But if it feels like the Facebook presence is like somehow involved in the algorithm now. So like there's so much hope, and it's all rumors and speculation. Nobody knows what's really happening. But obviously Instagram is trying to step up to fill that void. Plenty of people on TikTok are saying they're deleting Instagram because they don't want any part of Facebook. So I don't know how that's going to play out.
Whatever. Yeah, I
We'll
get
find
that a
out. We'll
month.
find out, I'm sure. It
Yeah.
won't be
I
long.
did see this morning though that Mr. Beast has put his hand in to possibly buy TikTok. So
There's plenty of offers out there.
yeah.
That's not the issue. It's like China is just not willing to sell, and the way the company is structured is the China. I'm not sure what he's called, the supreme leader, the whatever they call their big guy over there. He
Yeah.
gets the final vote on this. Like he actually has one share. They call it the golden share. And if he doesn't like the deal, it doesn't happen. So it's basically going to come
Yeah.
down to the president of China, President Trump. And they're going to have to try and hash something out. And I don't see that happening, but who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. We'll find out probably maybe by the next show. We'll know what's going on, but we'll see.
We
But
say
this
that
week,
every show.
we say that I will know what's going on next week. But who is up this week, JD?
This week we've got Joseph Finder coming back on. Joe's a New York Times bestselling author of 15 suspense novels, including House on Fire, The Fixer, and Suspicion. Two of his books have been made into feature films. His latest novel is called The Oligarch's Daughter and releases January 28th. Here he is, Joseph Finder.
Hey, Joseph Finder, congratulations on the new release. We're going to talk about The Oligarch's Daughter, but I want to talk to you for a bit about your career and writing, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Great. Good to be here.
So you've written, I didn't count how many books you've read, but you've written a fair few. They tend to be standalones, although I do remember you had a series a little while back. So just tell me about your approach to writing. When you're thinking about your next book, do you think, because I come from the indie world where we think a lot about series.
Yes.
Do you think about series, or do you think about, you seem to enjoy the standalone novels?
That's the thing, is that I like both. And what I found is that there are ideas I can do only in standalones that don't work in series. As you know, because you write a series characters have to be a certain type of person. They have to be an investigator of some sort. And some of my standalone ideas are about regular people who get caught up in things beyond their power, and their lives are turned upside down. And that can't happen regularly to a series character. But I'm sort of freer to do a certain kind of idea in a standalone book than in a series.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose you're right. If I think about the big series, the sort of the Jack Reachers and James Bond, there's a certain amount of routine and pattern to their books, which your books, because they're quite explosive, especially the first third of them, I guess you're right, that couldn't really happen too often.
No, it's not plausible.
You kill people quite a lot, I notice.
I do. I enjoy it. I sit here in front of my desk, powerless man. All of a sudden, I'm powerful.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have said that. I'm
I
sorry.
hope there's not a wire on it. Well, no, I mean, come on, that's why we write to an extent, isn't it?
Yeah, which is, by the way, why I think writers are such sort of congenial people, is they get all their darkest wishes out on the page. And they tend to be zen.
It is
Most of them.
absolutely remarkable when you think from a writing point of view, and your novels sell really well. You're really widely read. You're a bit of a novelist. If you think how many people read them, and when you sit there at your keyboard just the pure enjoyment of creating this fantastic story, universe, world, characters, killing them, making them have successes and failures. It's a huge thing when you think about it like that.
Yeah, it's a very big deal. And I've got books where there are sort of aspirational aspects. I've books that are about ambition, and I think that one of the things I've done in writing, alternating between standalones and series, is allowing myself to write different kinds of books, different kinds of stories, which is my way of keeping it fresh.
Yeah, when you say different kinds of stories, can you give me examples of what you mean by that?
Sure. I've got a book called Killer Instinct, and it's about a regular guy who meets up with this former special forces guy who's a tow truck driver, and he brings this guy gradually into a baseball game and then into his company, and this guy sort of takes over his life. And this is one that I've always wanted to be made into a movie or a TV series. So we'll see. And yet I've got stories where, like in The Oligarch's Daughter, I brought in two strands of plot together. We start with a guy running away into the woods, and another guy who turns out to be the same guy, who is sort of very much at ease, meets a beautiful woman, falls in love with her, and we know his life is about to turn upside down. He doesn't know that. So they're very different kinds of stories.
Yeah, they're very different kinds of stories. Okay, so let's talk about The Oligarch's Daughter. I mean, one question I did want to ask you. I noticed there's quite a bit of Wall Street and so the city stuff, what we call city in the UK, in this. Is that a background of yours, or just you think it's a good setting for somebody to emerge from difficulties in?
It's not a setting of mine. I mean, I've done a fair amount of research, and for this book, I talked to a lot of hedge fund guys in their early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, to get a sense of what it's like to work for these very wealthy firms in which there's a lot of pressure and a lot of ambition, and sometimes colleagues knife one another, figuratively speaking. So I thought, I've got an oligarch. What kind of person would be most plausibly brought into his orbit? And I thought, someone who's an investor, who's really good at taking money and making a lot more of it. Someone like that would be more likely to be brought into the orbit of a Russian oligarch. So that means I set out for myself the job of doing some research, figuring out what the guy's life is like, giving enough detail, not too much, but enough detail to make it plausible, make the world feel real. So basically, that was the reason I did it that way, is because I wanted to bring these two major characters together. My oligarch, Arkady Galkin, and a character once named Grant, now named Paul Brightman, and bring them clashing together.
Yeah, I mean, that is completely plausible, isn't it? You've got investment bankers are exactly the sort of people who are going to end up in the sphere of influence of oligarchs. Although I'm assuming, I don't know if this came out in your research, that a lot of the mainstream banks, I mean, they surely are holding oligarchs at arm's length at the moment, or not being their bankers, or is this just going on under different names?
Well, I have two answers. One is that a whole chunk of this book takes place before the war in the Ukraine. So this was when people were taking in oligarch money happily and investing. The second thing is that I think it still goes on. There are shell companies formed all the time. Property is bought in the name of shell companies. Their names are not on it. So you make a deal with Thornton LLC. You have no idea who the hell this is, but you may have heard rumors, but you want the money.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's all sorts of processes they go through. No, in the UK, it's called know your user or know your customer.
Right.
But it doesn't surprise me to learn that that's not as robust as it perhaps should be.
Not as, and especially in the UK.
Right. Yeah, the Russians all come to London, don't they, to invest?
They all do. They buy property. They send their kids to school there. Yeah, it's a playground for the oligarchs.
So you have written this book, and it is about a man whose life doesn't turn out to be what he thought it was, should we say? I don't know, because I'm not that far through it, so I don't want to give any spoilers away as to what happens. But it very much fits into the kind of feeling we have about Russian oligarchs that's really come to the top, really come to the front of our attention since the war in Ukraine. Did you start this story before that invasion, or was it as a result of us becoming a lot more aware of these guys?
I came up with the idea before the invasion. And while I was working on it, I was actually working on a couple of books, but that was one of the ideas in the forefront of my mind. While I was working on it, the invasion happened. And I thought to myself, so am I screwed here? No. In fact, the world changes after the war in Ukraine begins, but that could make it really interesting. And that could explain something. So that was why I split up the narrative into two timelines. One is 6 years ago, one is today.
And I don't know how old you are, but I'm 57. I grew up in the original Cold War, and I have to say, completely gripped by East Berlin and those days. I read books on the Vietnam War I'm reading at the moment. I write novels set in 1960s to the early 1970s. So when people talk about the new Cold War now, it's a terrible thing to say, but I only say this as somebody who's a writer and interested, kind of looking forward to that position again of the intrigue, of this spy craft that went on that had to be developed at that time, of the dangers involved, and information being the only thing that governments had on each other was how good their spies were. And that was a fascinating time for me. Clearly, this book, I think, taps into that now.
Taps into that for sure. It's into the new Cold War, where espionage is important, but also, the Russians, the GRU in particular, the military intelligence agency, have killed people, assassinated people in the West, in the UK, as you know, in Istanbul and various places. And that used not to be the case. It only happened in the old days, in Robert Ludlum novels, where people were killed in Washington by the Russians. That was a sort of against the rules, but it's starting to happen. And I thought to myself, that's scary. The best thrillers are premised on fear. That's really what brought about the spy novel, is some kind of fear. Spy novel was born in the UK, I would argue, in the fears of a German infiltration right before World War I. And there was kind of an overwhelming fear that made us that kind of paranoia that was the locus, was the engine, I should say, for the spy novel to begin with. And so, there was a time in the 1990s when Russia was our friend, we thought. I don't think we actually ever trusted each other. And the Russians accuse us of tricking them in the 90s. And there is such a distrust between Russia and the West that's gotten a lot worse. That's made this idea of the new Cold War interesting to novelists like us.
Yeah. Do you think it's a there's a different texture to this Cold War, then a nastier edge to it. I mean, the odd dissident got bumped off. I remember back in the early Cold War, we had a guy, the Romanian Secret Service, or Bulgarian Secret Service, I think, used an umbrella to stab a guy in London. But you're right,
an umbrella, yes,
yeah, it was pretty rare. I mean, Trotsky had a nice pick through his head. I wonder if the difference this time is it's personal, because it's Putin. It's dissident. It's opposition. It's not dissidents. It's opposition to Putin. They're the people in danger, aren't they?
Yes. Anyone who speaks out against Putin, including very rich people, including oligarchs, and that intrigued me. I sort of thought, and someone who is as powerful and wealthy as some of these oligarchs, as my fictional oligarch Arkady, would be afraid to speak out against Putin, because he could be knocked off.
Yeah.
So that makes him, to me, a more interesting character, because he's got his own things he's afraid of.
Yeah, and you certainly get the feeling that a lot of the oligarchs serve at the pleasure of Putin, and in a way that they've got rich under he's allowed them to run their sort of mafia-like organization.
Right. Putin inherited 7 or so oligarchs from the Yeltsin days. But he brought them to heel.
Yeah.
And the oligarchs who got rich under Putin got rich because of Putin.
Yeah.
So I think these oligarchs are beholden to Putin. They fear him. And yet, here's what's interesting. They also have a lot of power. And Putin knew that. And that's why he met with the oligarchs right on the same day he invaded the Ukraine. He wanted to assure them that things would be okay. They were all sanctioned by the West, but he wanted to assure them things would be okay, despite the war.
He predicted that the West would go after the oligarchs, hoping that they would turn on Putin. So he was ahead of that curve.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about kind of Russian character here? Is this something you've had to, a good novelist, which you are, empathizes with their villains, even if they're serial killers, get inside their heads? Have you found any sort of sympathy for the Russian worldview?
Yeah, I have. I've been to Russia a number of times. I once lived there for about a month, and I know a lot of Russian emigres over here. I went to school with some of them, and I love Russian culture. I love Russian literature. There's something really warm about Russian families, and the way when I would visit Moscow, these Russians would invite me in for dinner. They had no food, but they spared what little they could just for the guests. So I love Russians and love Russian culture, and I wanted to put that across in The Oligarch's Daughter, where I wanted to sort of make it clear how inviting Tatiana's, that's the girlfriend, Tatiana's family is, Paul. And to explain why one of the reasons he is so in love with this woman is he loves her family.
Yeah. And that's part of the predicament that he's in, isn't it? So I do remember I went to Moscow before the invasion, thank goodness, actually. It was my only time to go there, and wanted to see some of the sort of military sites. And it was the middle of the Syrian conflict. And Bashar, was that his name? Was, just murdering his own people in great number. It was absolutely awful. We were almost powerless to intervene because the Western populations were fed up with interventions, and I felt awful about it. And I remember speaking to the first Russian guy, obviously my driver, from the airport, and he said, yeah, he's our friend. We support him, he supports us. And I was thinking there was no morality in that sentence. There was no question of, well, he's killing people. For me, was a little glimpse into the Russian worldview is, I think, a little, maybe I'm being naive, but a little bit different from the Western view, which might think first, aren't people going to suffer?
Yeah. It's very transactional.
Yeah.
And they get that from their leadership. and from the propaganda that they're all subjected to. There's a lot of propaganda today. There's basically, Russian TV is all comes from the same place. It all has the same message, very I think the Russians are, if they don't get their news from some other place, they get it from Russian TV. If they get their news from some other place, that makes them unusual. To get their news from Telegram and channels like that, they're very careful about where they get their news from. There's a lot of fear over there.
Yeah. I suppose that's why if we were expecting there to be large-scale protests on the streets of Russia about the Ukraine war, we were disappointed because
Exactly.
they watched their own news programs.
Right.
Yeah.
And they during the war, this war is going to end.
Yeah.
And when it does, Putin basically has to answer to his people. And he wants the war to continue for that reason.
That's a depressing thought.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So towards the end of this book, which I haven't got to yet, what do you do with the Ukraine war? Is it still going on at the end of this?
Yeah, I bring these two plot lines together, and what is happening takes place in the present time, during the Ukraine war. And so it's all very contemporary.
Yeah.
That's the way it ends up.
So when you
Talk about more because I don't want to spoil the read for you.
No, please don't. I'm enjoying it very much. And the writers, I noticed you've got quite a lot of cover quotes from some very, very good writers.
Yeah.
The writer who came to mind, I grew up as a sort of teenager on Tom Clancy books set in Moscow. I absolutely loved them. I think your books are, if I might say this, and I love Clancy, your books are more sophisticated than that in terms of kind of the human relationships. I always felt that was a little bit lacking in Tom Clancy's books. Very good on the technical stuff, but his perhaps slightly one-dimensional characters. This is a character-led book. Right, I mean, that leaps out at you from the page. That's part of your writing, I guess, or something you set out to do.
Yeah, that I wanted to make this as character central as possible. There is the relationship between Paul and Tatiana. I mean, that's a romance that it turns into a marriage and a romance. For me, that was a challenge. I wanted to sort of focus on character development in ways that I hadn't quite done as deeply before. And I'm glad to hear that you find that it works. I think it does too, but it was not easy for me.
No, it's the most difficult thing. And I think the way that you reveal character in small little asides, the way that, I'm trying to think of examples. There's moments, I think, when he's allowed to do something by his wife, and it doesn't really strike you at the time necessarily, but he starts to build this idea that that's not necessarily a normal relationship.
Right.
Going on there. That's clever writing. The trick, do you think about this trick about how much you reveal, how much you make obvious? You don't want your reader to fall behind. At the same time, you don't want to make it too easy for them to work out what's going on.
Yeah, I do. You got it exactly right. I want the reader to put his her imagination to work in reading this book, which means you can't make everything too explicit or it's boring. That's a sign of a beginning writer, is when everything is spelled out on the page. For a writer who's sort of more accomplished, you learn not to do that. You learn to be subtle as much as you can, to let things develop in a dialogue. Character can develop in an exchange between two people. There are a number of ways you can have your main character observed by someone else. That's a standard classic way of characterization. But you want the character to emerge over the course of the book and not try to front load it, which is something which when I was starting out, I did. And I had some readers say, you give us too much up front. And then I realized people don't want that. You sort of think of it as if you were watching a movie where you begin to get to know the character more and more and more as the movie goes on. And that's what I think a good novel does as well.
That takes confidence as well. That comes from writing.
Confidence. But one of the things that we get to do that screenwriters of movies or TV can't do is we get to go into our main character's head.
Mm.
And that's one of the best ways of characterization, is to be inside the character's head. And it's a part of the toolkit that we get as novelists that other writers don't have.
Can I ask you a bit about process?
Sure.
Joseph, so when you start, do you have an outline? Do you write something down as an outline in your head? And what's the first draft look like for you?
Well, I start with a premise, and I quickly come up with the character who would be involved in this story. And then I do some reading, do some research, interviewing, talking to people. And what I'm doing is I'm coming up with the major beats in the book. And let me reference movies again. What I do is I try to come up with the trailer, movie trailer, where you see what are the main moments of drama that we're going to see in this book. I sort of try to come up with that. I outline people. I'm asked a lot, and I'm sure you are too. Are you a pantser? What are they? What's the expression?
Well, pantser or plotter, but people sometimes say discovery writer. It sounds slightly nicer than pantser. But
pantser, yeah, I don't like that. But anyway, so what I find is that I outline about the first 25% of the book. I get us to a major point, and I don't outline beyond that. Once I hit that point, I'm usually strapped in and moving fast. And so I am then asking myself, what's going to happen next? And what that means is there are twists that I would not have expected early on. I love to come up with things that the reader does not expect.
And do you end up coming up with stuff that you didn't expect?
I do.
Yeah, which
really
is a great thing.
And that can really only happen when you're doing discovery mode. When you haven't outlined it in advance. I'll tell you, so I knew Robert Ludlum. Ludlum and I had the same agent. And we sat down once for a drink, and he told me the secret to his process was that he outlined the whole thing in advance. He said, try it. Outline the whole book in advance. It'll be a breeze. So I tried it. I outlined a whole book in advance, and I had an outline of about 150 single-spaced pages. And when I was done, I had no interest in writing this book because I felt I'd written the thing already. So that made it boring. All of a sudden, I was like a factory worker putting widgets into place online. That's no way. It worked for Ludlum. It doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it comes down to the personality type, I guess, more than anything else. But it certainly did work for Robert Ludlum. He's one of the great thriller writers of my lifetime.
For sure.
Do you think about theme? Is there a sort of overarching theme you want a reader to take away from?
That is an interesting question. I do not think about theme while I'm writing. I think about character, and I think about plot. I think about story, making a story interesting. But what I find is that after I'm done with the book, themes have emerged. Not my intention, but they do emerge. So I think that writers who start out trying to put across a theme are boring. And that's not the way to tell a story. I mean, we're in this to tell stories, to grab people by their lapels and say, you got to read this thing. theme doesn't do that, or at least for me, it doesn't do.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a good quote I heard the other day from someone saying, when you're asked what's your new book about, the answer is, I don't know because I haven't written it yet. You'll find, the author will find out what it's about at the same time as everybody else.
My brother and I have two brothers, and we have a joke. Someone will say to you, what's your book about? And I'll say, it's about man's inhumanity to man. That sort of BS that critics write about later.
Yeah.
As theme. It's not the way a writer thinks, a storyteller thinks about it. I don't.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And my final sort of question on process, people do like to know this sort of thing. How do you physically write? Do you write in a Word document? Do you use Scrivener? Do you use a fountain pen?
I use Scrivener. I occasionally use a fountain pen and a yellow pad when I cannot figure out what to do next. And I want to I'll just sort of get away from the blinking cursor,
Yeah.
And I will sit there with the pen and the pad and just sort of scrawl notes. I find it's kind of liberating. Or when I'm taking notes on an interview, I do that on paper. But for the most part, I use Microsoft Word and then Scrivener. And that's mostly what I do.
And do you have set hours for writing? Do you set yourself word counts, anything like that?
I am incredibly strict about my process. I arrive at I have an office actually outside our home, which is lucky. And I get there before 8:30 every day. I take off one weekend day, and I sit here and write in the mornings, and I don't let myself knock off until noon or 1. And in the afternoon, I'll do business. I'll do phone calls. I'll go out and do errands. But I inevitably come back and try to set up the work for the next day so that when I sit down to write tomorrow morning, I've already gotten some notes planned out, tomorrow's scene, in a rough sort of way.
To make it easier to get going.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it overnight. What I find is that if you are having a plot problem, you can't figure out what happens next, take notes, and take notes before you go to bed. And you go to bed, you go to sleep, and when you wake up in the morning, the odds are you will have solved that problem. Sure. At least it works that way for me.
Yeah, let your brain do the work. So that period in the morning, is that solid writing? Do you write in 20 minutes and walk around the room and then come back, or do you?
Yeah, more like that. I'll write sometimes I'll just write and I'll look up and an hour has gone by. There are some scenes I've written where I look up and 2.5 hours have gone by. But for the most part, I'm kind of antsy. And I will sit here and I'll write for 10, 15 minutes. I'll get up and walk around, make some coffee, drink some water or something, go back to it after a few minutes.
Yeah, I think that works for me as well. But I do know, I do have friends who'll sit and do 20,000 words in a row, which I think is slightly insane.
Can't do it.
No, me neither.
I envy them, but I can't do it.
Yeah. My final area we'll talk to you about is your origins story. Everyone loves an origins story. So when did you start writing, Joseph? Was this something from childhood or later discovered?
Okay. The answer is both. I wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid. I remember when I was 8, I was telling people I wanted to be a novelist. And then gradually my parents talked me out of it. They said, this is no way to make a living. And they were both school teachers, and they were afraid that if I became a writer, I wouldn't make any money and it would be a bad life. So I thought about going to law school. I eventually did go to graduate school. And when I was in grad school, I came up with an idea for a nonfiction book which was centered around a guy named Dr. Armand Hammer, who was known as Lenin's Favorite Capitalist.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
And I found from my research in grad school that Hammer had been a member of the Communist Party. And I thought, that's interesting. What kind of guy is that? What's this all about? So anyway, I wrote a nonfiction book in my early 20s. And when I was done, I didn't have another idea for a nonfiction book. I wanted to write fiction. And several years went by while I did other stuff, and I read a lot of thrillers, took notes, and I had index cards in which I had lessons for myself about a book I'd read, how we meet the protagonist, who the villain is, and it's a bunch of different things I took notes on index cards for. And after, 4, 5 years, I finally had the courage to try to write, and I sent it to an agent and was turned down. And I did something that I think a lot of writers would be afraid to do. And that is, I actually got in touch with this agent, called him, and I said, I'm not trying to argue. I understand you don't want the book. I get it. Tell me why not. And I think the agent was so relieved that I wasn't trying to give him a hard time that he talked about what didn't work for him in the book. And I was taking notes while I was talking to him. And we talked for, 45 minutes, an hour. And I just this was this lesson in what not to do. And so I wrote another draft using those lessons, and I submitted it to a different agent who also turned it down. And I called that agent. And I said, tell me what you didn't like about this book. And he did. And then I rewrote the book, and I sent it to the same agent who turned it down with a note saying, sorry, not for me. So I left him alone. And I found that I ended up writing 25 drafts of my first book.
Wow. So you use the agent rejection as a process for improving your writing.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is why, all writers hate rejection. We all do. We hate bad reviews. We hate rejection. That's common. We're basically sensitive people. We wouldn't become writers if we weren't. But you've got to learn from rejection. The funny thing about being a writer is, on the one hand, you have to be really stubborn. Say, I'm determined to do this no matter what. On the other hand, you've got to listen to rejections and say, tell me what you didn't like about it. Why do they not like this book? And the more you learn from rejection, the better you become as a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do feel you've got to learn from rejections and not be deterred by them either.
Yeah, that's a brilliant process. Sort of on the job.
By the way, I'll tell you, I sent my first novel to an agent who sent it back. Those were in the old days where you would physically send a manuscript in a box, and they would send it back if you paid postage for it. They would send it back. The guy sent it back with a paperclip on page 55. And his note said, page 55 is where I stopped reading.
Okay.
If you haven't grabbed the reader by then, you're not going to this book's not going to work. So I sent that exact same manuscript to another agent, to Robert Ludlum's agent, who called me up and said, if you would be willing to cut out the first 80 pages entirely, I would be happy to represent this book.
Oh, so he got past the page 55 and then found the best of the book was beyond that.
Exactly. So I learned a lesson there too, which is you can be rejected by one agent and accepted by another agent on the same book.
Yeah. Well, that did require him to read the whole book.
It did, but actually he persisted. For some reason, there was something about it that made him want to keep reading.
Yeah. Wonderful.
And yet he didn't want to bore the reader up front. You got to grab the reader.
Yeah. Come in late, as they say.
As they say, exactly. Start
leave
late.
early.
Yeah.
Well, look, this is the book. We're not on TV because we don't do video on this podcast, but I have it in my hand. It's absorbing. It does indeed grab you from day one. It's got a wonderful first sort of 30 pages that sets everything up. I'm enjoying it. I think people will. Good luck with the Oligarch's daughter, Joseph.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And we'll look out for your next one. Are you already onto your next one?
Of course.
Of course.
Got it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good luck with that as well.
Thanks a lot. Great to talk to you.
Hey, before we ask questions, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you guys hear that theme music in your ears when we go between like that opening segment and the interview?
The A
Do you
Team?
hear it? No, the whole theme that we play on the podcasting. It automatically pops up in my head, even though we're not actively listening to it. So
The
I'm just trying to see
song
if I'm
is the
crazy.
one that plays in my head all the time. So that's just the A Team.
You may need to adjust your meds.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's what
Yeah.
it comes down to.
Oh, I like that though. I'll try that next time. I'll see if I
That's
can.
why I'm always shaking my head when we come out of it.
So
All
Joseph said something that I thought was interesting and true, is that with a standalone, you can turn a character's life upside down and they can have more change than in a series. You think that's the case? Do you write more
Yeah, I mean,
series
I
than
wrote.
standalones? What?
I run into the same problem that he has. I've got a lot of ideas that just don't work as a series. Either I kill everybody off, or like the entire story plays out, from start to finish, and you just can't keep it going. And, like, I never really thought about it, but James brought it up that an investigator is kind of the key to a series. Like, you need that one person that has basically an excuse to keep revisiting crazy scenario after crazy scenario after crazy scenario. So, James Bond, Jack Reacher, Agatha Christie did it really well in some of her novels. But you need that one thing that, can keep coming back.
Yeah. I think the reader is okay with that idea, though. That there's that suspension of disbelief where, yeah, we get it. Like, if this were a real human being in a real world scenario, this would be the most unlikely series of things to ever happen to one person.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not tuning in for that level of realism. We want realism in terms of things, when it comes to like thrillers and mysteries and things like that. We want to know that the sequence of events is realistic. We want to know. So I think in that way, it's kind of like the readers bringing their own multiverse to the reading, because they're able to look at this as they can suspend that disbelief in a way, and they can say, okay, this is just another universe in which, Jack Reacher, does this thing, and I've got a whole catalog of these kind of events in my head.
Yeah.
So,
I found that kind of with the serial fiction that I was writing, the sci-fi adventure. It was like book one was this big character change, and then book two was some character change. This is serial, so book length, book seasons, whatever you want to call them. And then after that, I was like, okay.
yeah.
But so it was more about the adventure than the character change at that point. But it is hard. You can't blow up a character's life that much.
I think you can have a growth arc, though, over the course of even an ongoing series.
Plan that in advance. Don't do it in your first book.
Well, don't do all the growth arc in one book, unless the idea is that growth arc is now leading to that ongoing, because it's kind of like the superhero growth arc in a way, right? Like, Batman loses his parents and then goes and trains. That whole growth arc could have happened in book one, and then you have the series that follows. I mean, I think that's acceptable, but I like to have, like, like Dan Kotler has grown since we met him initially. Not a ton. It's not the same growth arc. Like, he's not completely different by the end of each book, but he is vaguely different, and so you get that ongoing sense of growing alongside that character, which I think is crucial to a good story.
I agree.
Well, I mean, if you think about, like, a Jack Reacher has, like, literally no growth. right? From
None.
between
Yeah.
the book, like it's the exact same characters starting at each of those books. But the flip side of that is you can pick up any one of those books in any order and read them, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Like my only experience with this is my 4MK thriller series, and like you have to read all three books in order, or it's not going to make any sense to you. And there is growth and there's character development happening across that entire arc, the 3 book
Yeah.
arc. But like the story itself it takes place like that too. So like if you think of even in your Dan Kotler books, if you've got a
Yeah.
tiny little arc, let's say it takes place over 3 or 4 books, if you read those out of order, it's going to seem a little bit off. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
makes me wonder if Lee Child was maybe onto something, and that's the way we should be doing
And
it.
could be. And
Yeah.
it's a lot of work. I try very hard to make every one of those books, a jump on point. Like you could come in on any book. You should, in theory, be able to read that even out of sequence, and everything makes sense. So yes, there's going to be these little through lines that are disjointed. But I don't write them in that overt way. Like the A story of the book is the story. And then the rest of it really just sort of lends to the texture of the characters, you know? So, how many times have you tuned into a TV show or a movie, yeah, and you didn't know anything about these characters or whatever, but then through the course of watching, you find out that they had a previous relationship and they have
Yeah.
a kid somewhere, and they have
Right.
those details can come out, and I don't think it ruins the story. I don't think that I think some readers are going to be mad about it. I got one right now who's mad because I have crossovers and they didn't know, and and they didn't read those first, and that's you can't please everybody. But I
Yeah.
think the 98% of people are going to be okay with those little bits
That
of pepper.
there's external factors that can become a problem too. Like if your main character has a kid,
Mhm.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the age of your main character, like you can get away with not really saying that very often, but like people just assume that kids are getting older. So if you've got
yeah,
a book series that stretches 15 years and that kid is perpetually 8 years old, like eventually people call you out for that.
Yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's a catch 22.
So I ran into that with Kotler because he doesn't have a kid, but he has a nephew, and I had written as kind of a someone had asked me to participate in this like Minecraft thing, box set thing, and so I wrote a, a book about Alex Kotler, the young nephew, and he was probably maybe 8 years old or something. He's like an Encyclopedia Brown kind of character, and then later I wrote about him again and I just sort of included him a bit in one of the future books, and I aged him up. But now I started thinking about, I'm like, okay, so I can never, either I just ignore that and I go back, and if I want to write another Alex Kotler book, I have to age him back down again. Maybe it's a prequel or whatever, or I just drop that character altogether. And I chose B. He, he's out there vaguely somewhere.
You went to
No one knows how
college.
old he is. Yeah,
Goodbye.
yeah.
uh,
So
the other thing that I thought was interesting that Joseph talked about was how Ukraine changed his book. So he was writing one book, and then the Ukraine-Russia thing happened, and
yeah.
he had to totally change his book and do a part one and part two. Have you ever had like a real world event or something that's happened where you've had to change your book mid-writing?
I pretended COVID didn't even happen from a writing standpoint. Because like I still get freaked out if I read a book and like the characters are going through COVID. Like it's got me reaching for masks and disinfecting everything, and I don't want any part of that.
Yeah. No, this constantly happens to me. Especially as AI becomes more
Yeah.
relevant. Because one, I have a series that's based on an AI that it was, at the time that I started it was far more advanced than any AI we have, and now it's starting to kind of look a little tame compared to, where we
Right.
were going. But yeah, I kind of gloss over it and just kind of keep going. Like, unless it's just something major. There was a book I actually abandoned because the the reality surpassed what I was doing, and there was no way to fix it, and without just completely rewriting the whole book. So which I am fine with, but it was sort of like, well, the whole plot hinged on this idea. And then that one idea went and just became reality. And now we're already on the other side of it. And there's nothing I could write that would be like, I don't want to write a history of that. I just wanted to tell an interesting story. So that one's probably never going to see the light of day.
Fair enough. Okay, I have to ask this. Have you ever called an agent to ask why they didn't take your book?
Called them? No, I've emailed,
Yeah.
to try. When I did Fourth Monkey, I had a crazy slew. I think I queried 50 some agents and I got 13 responses back with offers. But some like they all gave advice on the book, and like two of them I think wanted me to strip out the diary sections of 4MK, which is in today's world that's like the fans' favorite part. So a lot of times they give you advice that doesn't make sense. But there was nothing more frustrating than getting a rejection letter back that didn't tell you why. So I would email them back and just see if they were willing to give me specifics. And I had like a little canned piece of text I would just copy and paste and drop into that email to try and solicit that. And I always encourage friends to do that too, because if an agent's turning it down, there's a reason they're turning it down. A lot of times that could be a very valid reason, and you might be able to use it to tweak your book. That being said, I don't know that I would have rewritten the same book. What do you say, 25, 30 times?
Yeah.
Because of that.
So you have a canned response to canned responses, is what you're saying? Like you have a
I do, or I did at the time, because I just got tired of typing the same sentences over and over again. So I just copied and pasted them into a note document, just to save myself a couple of seconds.
I have been really fortunate in that every rejection I've gotten has included some personal note about why it was being rejected. Now, I don't know if I actually kind of think of that as being a real positive thing, because they were moved enough to write something to me that says something, and I didn't take it as encouraging at first, I'll confess, but now looking back, I'm like, oh, that was actually like, I remember one of the first short stories I ever submitted to Analog. I got a personal note back. I got a form letter, but written on the form letter was a personal note from the editor at that time, and I can't remember who it was, but saying, with some suggestions. And one of those was, don't use dialogue for exposition. And so I rewrote the story and sent it back, and hey, based on your note, and I addressed him specifically, like, based on your note, I did this. And he wrote back and said, great, still doesn't work for me. So I'm like, okay.
But you never called an agent.
No, I've never.
I just was like, I can't imagine being the agent on the receiving end of that and having an author call. I'm like,
I feel like that probably happens a lot, don't you think? I mean, I feel like.
Yeah,
I don't think that's a professional way to go.
I don't know if it would still happen now, but I was like, ooh, I don't think I could call an agent. I'm like, I don't think I recommend that.
No, show up at their house while they're in the shower. Totally.
Perfect.
I do that all the time.
Writers Inc. does not endorse you showing up at an agent's house.
This is not legal advice or life advice.
I don't like calling my agents now, and like then they work for me. I don't know that I would trust myself on that phone call either. I feel like I communicate a lot better in writing, especially when it's a situation like that. Like I can get my thoughts clear and concise, before I hit that send button. I don't think I'd pick up the phone for that.
Yeah. That's kind of a rule break, with the rules. I'm like, oh, rule break, but it worked out for him. So I'm always curious to hear what writers have done that are rule breaks that have worked for them. So
yeah. I don't want feedback vocally. I want feedback in writing, because vocally I'm much more inclined to just ignore you and get pissy and say things I shouldn't say or whatever.
Just to play devil's advocate here, Joe's been in this business for a while now, and chances are back when he was talking to agents or looking for an agent, a phone call was the only way to get in contact with somebody.
That's probably the case. That's what I'm imagining. Yeah.
I was like, I forgetting about carrier pigeons.
Yeah, no, you would write the letters and you would call, and I think that's less accepted now. Don't call your agent, especially if they're not your agent.
That should be the title of this episode. Don't call your agent.
Don't call your agent. Or other agents. All right. Awesome. With that, JD, who is up next week?
Next week, we've got Lucy Rose coming on. Lucy's an award-winning writer, director turned author. She's going to be here to tell us about her debut novel, The Lamb, which releases February 4th. Lucy Rose.
Awesome. If you'd like to be notified as soon as new episodes publish, make sure you go to writersincpodcast.com and sign up now. We'll see you next episode and have a great week of writing.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Writers Inc. Access the show notes and leave a comment at writersincpodcast.com.